So hi everyone, welcome to week 3 of Types of Forced Migration with UCC National Ministries. My name is Irene Willis Hassan. I'm the Minister for Refugee and Migration Services with UCC National on Team Global Hope. And this series is meant to help churches learn the different types of visas and how they pertain to the U.S. resettlement system. The first week we did an overview of the international migration system and why it acts the way that it does. And then the second week we talked about refugee resettlement, which, as a short review of that, it's the easiest type of migrant to host because they receive the most services. That doesn't mean that they've not been through the same kinds of trauma as others. It just means that they've been through the system longer. Refugees can be processed between 2 and 30 years. So by the time that you are hosting a refugee by the time a local office is hosting a refugee, that means that they've been through the system for a long time, which is why they receive the services that they do. Other types of migrants don't receive as many services. The type that we're going to be going over today is humanitarian parole. Most, and this is very odd and I'll explain why, but most refugees or immigrants, I shouldn't say refugees, but most forced migrants that are in the United States currently are actually on humanitarian parole. And this is the first time that that's happened in about 50 years. But we've had 2 mass humanitarian parole migrant populations come into the United States in the last year. And so that's why we're going to focus this week on it. It's not a usual designation, but it is a current designation. And then next week is going to be a longer session. We're going to be doing an hour and a half because we're going to be covering asylum, which is the most difficult type of migrant to host because they require the most services. But that of course doesn't mean that we as the church don't meet the needs of that population, because in a lot of ways, if we don't, who will? Refugee offices often don't work with asylum seekers exactly because of the amount of needs that they have. So I do hope that you all come to week 4. I think that's going to be the most important week of this four-part series, and if you're not able to come live, to watch the recording later. So again, this week is humanitarian parole, so I'm going to go ahead and start sharing screen about what that means. To be honest, I had to do some research on it myself because it's not a usual designation. I have never worked with it throughout my career. I've worked in refugee offices and international settings, and humanitarian parole was not really a buzzword that we ever used because it's been used twice this year, but not really a whole lot in the last couple decades at least, and I'll explain why. But you guys probably know a lot about humanitarian parole if you're currently hosting families, because the family you're hosting is probably on humanitarian parole right now. So let me talk a little bit about humanitarian parole versus asylum and what the difference is. So the difference between asylum and a refugee, which are the 2 main types of forced migration that we see coming to the United States, is, again, if you were here last week, every refugee that enters the United States once claimed asylum. Asylum means a person that goes to a secondary country and says, my life is in danger, and they're at the beginning of the processing. A refugee is much further along in that processing and is sent to a third country. So in this example, maybe someone from Somalia flees to Kenya claiming asylum. And then that person in Kenya eventually, after years and years, gets processed to become a refugee, and then they fly to the United States. That's the difference. Now, the difference between humanitarian parole and asylum is a bit dodgy, and we're going to talk about why that is. So in the research that I've done about humanitarian parole, it seems a lot like the difference is persecution versus poverty. Is one of the designations. Let me come back to that though. So actually, I'm not going to start with this slide. I feel like it's easier to start with examples of humanitarian parole. So I'm going to skip and come back to this one. Sorry, it's sort of a complicated thing to talk about. The whole thing is, right? So the very first use of humanitarian parole by the United States, some of you may remember this, some of you may have hosted folks on parole from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam after the Vietnam War. That's the first time that the U.S. designated the use of humanitarian parole. We had lots of UCC churches at that time probably through the help of some help of Mary, who's on this call, resettle this population. And I am grateful for that, and also for the current humanitarian parole populations that the UCC is resettling. What I think is interesting that came out of this, so it was 200,000 people at once, which is a lot. That's more than double what the US is currently offering to host in terms of refugees right now. So for that amount of people to come into the US on a special designation all at once was chaotic at the time, and we saw it happen again. Humanitarian parole basically is a very little used designation that when a special event occurs in the world, the US can make a decision to say, we're going to take this amount of forced migrants, people whose lives are at stake, and bring them immediately to the US without any of the processing of asylum and or refugee processing. So that's basically what humanitarian parole is the United States picks a world event, a crisis that's happening, that's creating people that have to forcibly flee from their homes, and decides that we're going to take a certain amount of that population in. So the amount that has been designated on humanitarian parole for Ukrainians, Biden said in, I think it was April, that amount is going to be 100,000. For Afghans, there was no decided amount because the event of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan was so sudden, but that was approximately 80,000 on humanitarian parole. I wasn't alive during Vietnam, so I'm not really sure how the amount of 200,000 was designated, or if it was designated, or if it was sudden, like the Afghan crisis, or a combination of both. But basically, humanitarian parole is a sudden response to a world crisis. You may ask why the crises that happen in Haiti, such as the coup or natural disasters that have occurred there, did not prompt humanitarian parole. And we'll get into that about why that could be, that humanitarian parole was not offered, to example, for Haiti or Sudan, even though they have similar mass migration crises, or Venezuela. As Afghanistan or Vietnam or others that have been granted humanitarian parole. So again, the definition of humanitarian parole as a whole is a particular group of nationalities or nationality that has undergone a very sudden current conflict in the United States, makes a decision that we're going to take a certain amount of them in without processing them. And processing them once they get to the United States. So what I think is interesting about what happened with the Vietnamese parole population is because humanitarian parole involves a very sudden amount of one nationality entering the United States instead of the regular processing of asylum or refugee resettlement. There was suddenly a huge influx of folks from Southeast Asia that came into the United States all at once, and they didn't have the community beforehand to be able to resettle very easily and rapidly. And we see that also true with the Afghan situation, in that it used to be that Afghan refugees were resettled in very particular cities, and now they're everywhere because so many of them came at once. Same thing happened with folks from Southeast Asia after the Vietnam War. And so the response of Tippi Hedren, who was the star of, I think, Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, she decided to do this unusual thing where she poured a bunch of money into training Vietnamese folks to open nail salons. And so it may be that if you've gone and done your nails at any point in the last 50 years, that you'll notice that the folks that are running the nail salon are from Southeast Asia. This is not by mistake. This was done on purpose as a way to create businesses that put power into the hands of the refugees and autonomy, good income, while also not really having to know English. So there's a reason why the nail salon in your neighborhood may be run by Southeast Asians, and it's because Tippi Hedren created an entire system of being able to employ this very sudden influx of population from the very first humanitarian parole system that was created by the United States. And so I thought that was a really interesting outcome that I thought I'd share with you of humanitarian parole in 1976. And we'll see how And basically the reason why I tell you that is because when a huge amount of one population comes to the United States, it tends to change the entire geography of immigration. And that's one of the ways that that particular humanitarian parole system created a new dynamic in the United States. And we're seeing different new dynamics with the Afghan influx that happened last year as well, which I'll get to that. Also, this is where the evolution of MASH grant and micro enterprise grants came for refugee business owners. The UCC hosts a micro enterprise grant. We have one. If you have a humanitarian parole family that you're hosting, they are eligible after 6 months of work to be able to receive an empowerment grant that helps them open a business. Lots of folks from Southeast Asia or Africa or the Middle East thrive in small business economies. That's what they're used to doing at their home. And it may be that the best way for them to thrive and feel autonomous over their work in the United States is to open a business. And so the US refugee resettlement system specifically created a grant that, again, the UCC replicated, but there's also a federal grant for this in order to replicate what Tippi Hedren did for Vietnamese folks so that they could open their own businesses and create faster self-sustainability and better economic prosperity and futures for their kids. So that's one thing that came out of this humanitarian parole crisis in 1976. Oops, that button's not working. That button's not working either. My button's working. There we go. So the next humanitarian parole designation was in 2007. There wasn't a crisis in particular that happened in 2007, and I'll explain why Cuba was included in this group of humanitarian parole evacuations. This one is more like if Cubans had family already in the United States, then they were eligible to come to the United States and claim humanitarian parole. This is a very special program that was only for this particular population. And it also has some to do with the wet foot, dry foot policy, which you may have heard of, which was designated in 2002, which means that if Cubans are crossing the ocean in a boat and they are caught by U.S. Border Patrol in the water, they'll be sent back to Cuba. However, they make it to U.S. soil, they are able to claim humanitarian parole or asylum. This policy does not apply to Haitians who do the same thing. And again, I'll explain why that is. Well, I'll explain it right now. So humanitarian parole in general, and in this instance, very particularly, it's sort of used as political leverage because, again, Sudan was never offered humanitarian parole. Neither was Haiti, even though huge humanitarian crises happened there that could arguably be used to say, hey, there's a mass crisis happening in this country. Let's designate 50,000 people can come over and claim humanitarian parole. Humanitarian parole, by the way, it's only good for 2 years, and I'll repeat that somewhere because it bears repeating, that it's meant to be temporary while there's a crisis going on in a country, and then folks are meant to go back to their country or continue on to process to claim asylum, which is why I'll come back to the asylum page. I just wanted to explain different humanitarian parole situations first. That'd be a better place to start. So again, places like Haiti were not offered humanitarian parole. Cuba and Vietnam are the only two places before last year that were offered humanitarian parole. And I invite you to think about what Cuba and Vietnam have in common. And that is that the US has strong political ties with Cuba and with Vietnam. We had wars going on that affected both of those populations. And also there's economic leverage to be had. So political and economic leverage plays out in the US's decision to grant humanitarian parole. In fact, they say in the language on the USCIS website that humanitarian parole is only granted for populations that, let's see what the exact language is, I wrote here somewhere. There is an urgent humanitarian reason or significant benefit to allowing temporary access to the United States. And so the US designates significant benefit as being do we have a political or economic reason to let this particular population in? For Haiti, the answer is no, not really. We don't have any sort of economic benefit to letting that population in. Same thing with Sudan. Cuba, Vietnam, yes, we had lots of economic and political investment in those two places. So that is sort of the reason why some places are given humanitarian parole and others aren't, is because the United States has specifically designated through this language right here at the bottom of the page where it says USCIS language, that it has to demonstrate significant benefit. And so that's what it appears to be. The significant benefit is, do we have an economic reason to let these folks in? Not a humanitarian one, but an economic one. Because if you remember from the first week, an overview of the migration system is that states can pick and choose who they want to let in. There's no real language that creates good parameters around what migration should look like or what's fair. So this language is made up. So we'll move on. So the next time humanitarian parole was used was last year. So again, 1976, 2007, and that wasn't a significant crisis. The only reason why they stopped that program was, it's still not really stopped, but they stopped really using it in 2017, and that was just because of political embargoes against Cuba. So last year in 2021, of course, most folks who are hosting migrants right now are hosting Afghans because, again, a humanitarian parole means that a lot of one nationality comes all at once. So Afghans entered the United States on humanitarian parole, which means that they didn't have an asylum. They hadn't already been started processing for asylum anywhere, which means that they didn't go to Pakistan. They didn't go to Uzbekistan or anywhere to say, hey, I'm going to die if I stay in Afghanistan. They were directly airlifted from Afghanistan. And then they weren't processed as refugees. Some of them were in the process of becoming SIV refugees, which means special immigrant visa, which means that you've served the United States military for 2 years, and so you're granted a special visa to come to the United States for your service. But a lot of these folks had not finished their SIV process, and so came over on humanitarian parole. This special population was given the same benefits as refugees, which was decided after the evacuation. Shortly, a couple months later, they decided, yeah, that's okay if they get the same benefits as refugees. They were processed at the military bases over a couple months, being given vaccinations and vetting them for terrorism and other things. All this process was done very quickly, which is normally done over the course of years. But all these folks still need to have their status adjusted. Because again, it bears repeating, humanitarian parole is meant to be 2 years or less, and then they're meant to return back to their home country. Lots of folks from Afghanistan are predicting that they probably won't go back to Afghanistan. So many of them are adjusting their status to asylum, which is the most common way. And again, asylum means that this is my secondary country. I'm going to make a claim that I personally will die if I go back to Afghanistan. And so this is their chance to make that claim that they can't go back after 2 years. And then a lot of them are going to be eligible for SIV, which again, special immigrant visa. It means they worked for the US military. So those who want to be processed for the SIV have to get a COM, which means Chief of Mission. It means some fancy guys look at it and say, oh yes, that person did work for this commanding unit, and they are eligible to be processed for SIV, and then they can go on to be processed for SIV. Many Afghan families prefer the SIV processing because it gets them benefits quicker. Asylum seekers do not get any benefits at all while they're doing asylum. They still have to level up to refugee eventually. SIV skips that process. So it might be that your families would prefer to attempt to get the SIV designation. Again, you have to be serving in the US military for 2 years in order to get the SIV designation. And for either SIV or asylum, you do have to claim with evidence that you will die if you go back to Afghanistan. So that's a process that's happening for many of our Afghan families right now, is they're currently attempting to adjust their status from humanitarian parole. The UCC is active in trying to advocate for the Afghan Adjustment Act. This has been in Congress being argued over for months. And this would just adjust all of the humanitarian parolees that came over from Afghanistan into being formal refugees without having to go through asylum or SIV. It's a highly contested bill. Because again, humanitarian parole is only used in situations in which the US feels responsible, political, and economic ties with the country that they're taking the parolees from. And so the argument is that folks from Afghanistan served our country. They were occupied by our country for 20 years, and they just deserve the adjustment regardless. And so that's being argued in Congress. It has not yet passed, but that would, if that was passed, that would bypass the need to do any of this status adjustment for all of these Afghan folks coming in, which would be less of a headache for the immigration system, which I think is really the argument that they're trying to make right now. So another concern that you may be hearing from your humanitarian parole families, if you are hosting Afghans right now, is that their brothers, sisters, mothers, uncles, friends, fiancés, somebody got left behind. In every family, someone got left behind because of the nature of how quick and violently this happened. And so many of our families have been asking the churches hosting them if they will help sponsor humanitarian parole for their families who got left behind. And we've had a lot of churches apply for humanitarian parole for the families that got left behind. And it seems to have overwhelmed the system because like I said, every Afghan family that is currently in the United States got someone left behind. And so all of them are applying for humanitarian parole, which, as previously mentioned, is an almost never used designation. So there's probably not very many guys at USCIS who traditionally work on the humanitarian parole processing. And suddenly they're getting thousands of applications for humanitarian parole from Afghanistan. And unfortunately, the response to that has been, the link's in here and I'll send it in the follow-up email to that they have basically shut down humanitarian parole to Afghans. None of the churches that I'm aware of successfully got the family members out of Afghanistan, but it seems that the US government thinks we fulfilled our contract, we evacuated that initial 80,000, we can't process all of these thousands of humanitarian parole applications, we're shutting it down. So there's really very specific ways that you can be eligible for humanitarian parole if you're Afghan. You can look at the site yourself. Again, I'll send it in a link in the follow-up email. But basically it says that you have to have very specific criteria in order to be eligible for humanitarian parole if you are Afghan, and you cannot apply on the internet. You can only apply on paper, which is further evidence that they aren't really interested in processing humanitarian parole for Afghans left behind. This is highly unfortunate, but that's the way that it is. So that's humanitarian parole for Afghanistan. Sorry, my computer, the buttons aren't working. Come on. There we go. Okay, so and the reason why humanitarian parole for Afghanistan may have been recently shut down is not only because so many applications suddenly came in after a period of 20 years of almost zero applications for humanitarian parole coming in. They're also shifting focus. The US government is shifting focus to creating a humanitarian parole system for Ukrainians. It was in March. You may remember back in March that the Biden administration announced the admission of 100,000 Ukrainian nationals. And he didn't specify what kind of visas they were coming on. That was my very first question when I heard this. Are they coming in on asylum? Are we giving them refugee visas? And it was recently designated in late April that they're going to be coming in mostly on humanitarian parole as well. Again, 2 humanitarian parole systems in 2 years. It's never happened before. And so the way that has worked is they're doing it under a program called Uniting for Ukraine. I will again send the link in the follow-up email. And that means that all humanitarian parole applications that are done on the internet, probably all humanitarian parole applications in general, are going to be specifically for Ukrainians, which we are grateful that the United States is doing something to help this massive refugee crisis. But again, a lot of it has to do with politics and economics rather than it does having equal burden about the real systems of displacement across the world. But so uniting for Ukraine basically means that if you are a family that has been displaced from Ukraine and you are hiding in Hungary or Poland or Belarus or somewhere else, or even still in Ukraine, you can apply for humanitarian parole in the United States. But the way that you do it is that you have to find a sponsor that is in the United States that's willing to be economically liable for you. So a family that is in Poland meets a family that's in the United States, or they have family in the United States or friends that says, I will sponsor them, I will be financially liable for them and get them all the things that they need to get on the ground started. And then within 90 days, and then they make this application called an I-134. The church or family or whoever in the United States does this, and on behalf of the family that's in Ukraine or Belarus or Poland. And then in 3 months is the predicted timeline. That family that's over in Eastern Europe can come over on humanitarian parole, and they will be eligible for work visas. They're not eligible for status adjustment right now. It's meant to be temporary, and they're meant to go back to Ukraine within 2 years. But they can come over and work as long as they have someone sponsoring them. This is something the church can do, and it's brand new. There is not very good systems set up in place to help facilitate that yet because it's so new. Church World Service, and I'll go over more closely how you can sponsor a Ukrainian family. Church World Service is setting up the ability to do that. We may also have conversations within the UCC of the ability to do that, or work with partners to see what we can do to meet this need. But these are ongoing conversations because this is such a new situation. But if you independently know a family that's in Ukraine, you're welcome to contact me. We can talk about how to apply for an I-134 to be able to get that family over here, and it's likely that they would get the visa and they would come over. Sponsorship means that you do everything from finding an apartment, to paying for that apartment, to making sure that they're fed and that their kids are enrolled in schools and that they receive a social security number and get all the things they need, just like you would for a refugee or an asylum, well, not an asylum seeker, just like you would for a refugee, but with less monetary support. Yeah, because they're not eligible for SNAP, food stamp benefits, or refugee cash assistance, or TANF, like a refugee family would be. So that's brand new. Let's see, let me go back to this slide since I sort of skipped it. So the difference between humanitarian parole and asylum. So I wrote persecution versus poverty. So a lot of, and again, I went over this in the first week, is that the definition of what a refugee is that was designated in 1951 is extremely narrow. So basically, you have to prove that you are persecuted based on your religion or your political identity or your cultural identity, your gender identity, to be able to claim asylum. That's the only way. But we're seeing mass movements of migration of folks that are fleeing climate disasters, they're fleeing corrupt governments, gang violence, mass poverty, and those don't warrant as reasons to be able to claim asylum. So anywhere in which there is mass poverty tends not to be able, the US doesn't seem interested in granting humanitarian parole. Venezuela is a very good example, is that Venezuela is one of the top 5 countries in which people are forcibly displaced. Have we granted humanitarian parole for this population? No, we have not. And the reason why is because we don't have an economic reason to do so. They're seen as being more a poverty country than one that has downright persecution. This is totally arguable that that is not the case, but because the US can pick and choose who they want to bring in, Venezuela didn't get humanitarian parole. Venezuelans are eligible for TPS. In fact, so are Haitians, so are folks from Sudan, Honduras, and other places are eligible for TPS, which means temporary protected status. So that means that if you are from one of those countries and you are already in the United States on a tourist visa or a a work visa or a student visa or something like that, you can claim temporary protected status, which means that you can't get deported after your visa runs out. Now, the problem with temporary protected status is that the government knows that, so they tend to not allow folks from those countries to even get temporary visas, so they can't turn over and claim temporary protected status and stay in the United States past their visa. Syria is another one of those places. There's a list on the USCIS website of places that can claim temporary protected status, which kind of has a mixed bag about how it works for those countries. Because it means it's very hard for them to get in, but if they do get in, then they can stay. And again, a lot of this is just dependent on the power dynamic between the country in conflict and the USA. Does the USA have political power to be gained or economic power to be gained by granting parole for this mass amount of people? If the answer is no, they probably won't. Which again, my examples are Sudan, Venezuela, Haiti. No humanitarian parole, no political gain from that. So that's sort of the difference that you see between populations that are granted humanitarian parole and are not. And everyone else is meant to just go claim asylum. And I put down the language between the difference at the bottom just so that you can see sort of what the expectations are. Humanitarian parole, like I said, there has to be a benefit to the United States. There has to be political or economic gain for them to want to grant you the sudden route of humanitarian parole versus asylum is that you have to prove that you're worthy of being able to live. And so those are sort of the differences that a lot of it is sad. Also, I wrote down sudden versus slow burning, like if your country has been in political conflict for a long time and has resulted in mass gangs. We see a lot of countries in Central America, like the Northern Triangle of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, having these problems of slow burning violence and poverty problems. Then that's considered not to be eligible for humanitarian parole. Versus something sudden, like the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's sudden, that's eligible for humanitarian parole. However, obviously, natural disasters don't count. Otherwise, Haiti would have gotten humanitarian parole a couple times over. Sorry, hold on. Like I said, I need to do some adjustments in my mouse. Thank you for bearing with me. Okay. So co-sponsoring humanitarian parole. Like I said, the only population currently eligible for humanitarian parole as well, technically you can apply for humanitarian parole from wherever, but the only one that USCIS really specifically says they want on their website, you can read the language yourself, is Ukrainians. So in order to co-sponsor a Ukrainian family, you need to be connected with the Ukrainian family wherever they are in the world, which is most likely Eastern Europe. And again, we are working on the appropriate systems and partners to do that so that we can connect churches with families through the appropriate resources and channels. Also, if you just have friends over there, this is your opportunity to bring them over if that's something that you feel called to do. And then churches apply for the I-134, which again is a demonstration of sponsorship where you give all your financials to the US government and say, I have enough money to be able to sponsor this family. I would like to do so. So right now, like I said, Church World Service is working on creating a system to train churches to be able to sponsor Ukrainian families and match them with Ukrainian families. And they haven't fully vetted that program yet. So I am going to drop the link to being able to connect with Church World Service to learn more about their program so that when it is up and running, they'll be able to give you information and connect you. And like I said before, it's going to be an approximate 3-month waiting period between the time that you apply with your I-134 for the family and that they actually come to the United States, which in relativity of forced migration is a very, very short period of time. Humanitarian parole is a 2-year contract, and then they're expected to go home. It can be extended by applying for asylum. Again, the sort of tiers are humanitarian parole, which is sudden, and only certain certain populations are eligible for it if the U.S. government deems that they want to deem this a humanitarian parole situation. And then the next level is asylum, in which you can stay longer than 2 years. And the next level is refugee, in which you are able to stay permanently and receive services to resettle into the United States. So those are the three tiers: humanitarian, parole, asylum, and refugee. So I go over this in almost every one of these meetings. This is everything that goes into co-sponsoring a family. If you should decide to co-sponsor a Ukrainian family, then these are all the things that would go into it, just like any other population. Everything from getting them oriented into healthcare, job training, English tutoring, helping them navigate the public transportation system. You got to find them a house. You got to furnish it. You have to pay for that house until they're able to pay for it themselves. And everything else that comes in between of resettling a family in the United States, helping them adjust status eventually if they become eligible for that. And again, we can go over this in more detail if you decide that this is something that you would like to do, or Church World Service will also help you do that if you invest into going into their program to sponsor a family. And the proposed action model that I always ask for churches to consider when they want to resettle any type of forced migrant, from humanitarian parole to asylum to refugees, is to do it in coordination with other churches or interfaith organizations or nonprofits in your area, because it is a lot of responsibility. So basically, this plan is just to get more support in your area and apply for funding where possible, work with professional partners who can guide you through the process. And then, we're here if you have any questions. Church World Service and UCC National Ministries is happy to guide you through the whole process. You'll never be by yourself. And of course, as always, we do offer all these things. We have grants. We can, if you don't have any churches in mind in your area, we can find ones that we can connect you to co-sponsor refugees, asylum seekers, or humanitarian parole. And we'll always tell you about updated migration patterns, as I just did with the new humanitarian parole system, which is basically exclusively for Ukrainians at this point. So that is my presentation on humanitarian parole. I know a lot of it, I feel like this one in particular was a lot of sort of sad information about the level in which government systems can pick and choose who they want to invite in and why. But we are grateful that so many Afghans were able to process in on this, as well as Vietnamese folks, or Southeast Asian folks, and Cubans, and now also Ukrainians. It is a good use. I just wish, as with most things of the refugee resettlement system, that things were more standardized, or that we had better international conversations about who's deserving to survive and why, because that's really the main problem, is who deserves it. Does someone that has been in a very sudden crisis like the Russian invasion of Ukraine deserve to survive more so than someone who is being chased by gangs because they're in debt in Venezuela? I don't know, but according to the US government, they don't have the same level of worthiness. So that's the overview, and I'm happy to now open it up for questions.
I have two. I was interested in the comment that you made that political conflict issues in gangs. Could you tell us more about that?
Sure. So, in places where there's been conflict that's long-standing, you see a lot of gang violence, because when governments break down over a long period of time, that really welcomes gangs and human trafficking in, which we see a lot of that in Central American states because of the long-standing conflicts and political breakdowns of systems happening there, as well as in the Horn of Africa. You see a lot of that going on too. Just because of the absence of a functional government, gangs tend to take over. And so that is often not accounted for humanitarian parole. That's not what they're looking for when they decide to create a system of humanitarian parole for a particular population, and or asylum or refugees. So folks that are susceptible to being in a corrupt government or a corrupt, like a country with a corrupt government that is being overtaken by gangs. The U.S. sort of says, "Too bad, so sorry," in most instances. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. I have some very conservative friends, and I've noticed that they seem to kind of merge the victims of gang violence with the gang themselves. There's
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you can say what you were going to say.
Yeah, so that's a real problem. Thank you for highlighting it. Is that victims of gang violence do not get the same eligibility for services and entry into the United States to survive because of this conflation of gangs and their victims, and that's just really unfortunate because they're definitely not the same. When we see these mass caravans of folks coming up from Central America, those are the victims. And even if it means that, anyway, I have lots of opinions on that, but yeah, I agree with you that it's unfortunate. They're not the same thing at all.
The other question I have is very practical again. When you're applying for I-134, who exactly do you apply to? Is it HTS?
You're applying to USCIS, which is the United States Customs and Immigration Services.
Thank you.
Citizenship and Immigration Services.
Citizenship, sorry, yes.
Not quite.
Thank you. Okay, and then I got a couple questions in the chat as well. Nancy, if parolees decide to apply for asylum, is there any national funding to help them get legal representation? You mean, is there any funding from UCC National, or is there any funding from the government?
UCC National. I mean, we have it in New Hampshire for people that are applying for asylum in New Hampshire, but it's really limited only to people that were formerly detained in the New Hampshire jail. So right now, for example, I'm working with 3 Haitians, and I'm collaborating with a Baptist church in New Hampshire, that's ethnic Haitian church, to raise funds so that these 3, actually it's a family and 2 individuals too, can apply for asylum, and they have to apply within a year after they set foot. And then, and since they don't have any work authorization, how are they supposed to get that money, which is usually, in the neighborhood of $5,000 to $10,000? Where's that money supposed to come from? So I was just wondering if there's any thought to national funding for that. It's a big need.
That's a cool idea, Nancy. I don't currently have a grant available for that. I'm about to redo all of our grants because they're all geared towards Afghan nationals right now based on the crisis last year. And of course, as the landscape's changing, that also means that we need to expand our grant opportunities. So that's a great idea. Let me look into what sort of funders we have and their expectations, and whether this would match any of the current funders' wishes for use for their money. Thank you for pointing that out. I will certainly look into that, but we currently do not. Doesn't mean that we won't. Okay, and then Rebecca asked, would you share how to access the Zoom recordings? So they are all right up top on the Refugee and Migration Ministries UCC website. So if you go to UCC Refugee and Migration Ministries, right directly on the page are all the past recordings that have ever been done through our office, including the previous ones to this series.
Irene, can I ask about the grants? You're reworking these. Last month, you sent me the links for the 2 for the Afghans. Well, it was 3 days before the deadline, and I couldn't turn the proposal application around. Do you have another funding cycle for that resettlement grant?
So unfortunately, we're closing the Afghan resettlement grant, and the reason why is because most of the Afghan, and they've closed the ability for Afghan nationals to come through, and so we've closed that cycle simply because we're not getting as many applications for it. That doesn't mean I can't have a conversation with you about ways that we can create, like I just told Nancy, where I'm in. This is one of my major projects over the next month is creating new grants. So if you want to just shoot me an email telling me what you're looking for, like I told Nancy, we can figure out if any of the funders who bring money into refugee and migration services match what your needs are, so that we can create grants that can match the most amount of people in their need.
Thanks.
But the empowerment grant is still open. That'll be open to the end of the year.
Yes, and we're going to work on that one for our ESL for the community.
Awesome.
So that's good. Yeah. Thank you.
Confirming that Afghan parolees will be classed as refugees once they receive asylum. No, incorrect. I'm sorry. So the way that it's going to work is that Afghan parolees can either apply for asylum or they can apply for SIV status. SIV status is sort of like being a refugee, but better and faster. They can become citizens way quicker on SIV. Most of your Afghan folks are going to want to apply for SIV. Most have probably worked in some capacity for the US government. But so what they have to do, and if you shoot me an email, I can walk you through this. I know all this is, even with the explanations, it's still super heavy, right? So what that family has to do is they have to apply for a COM, which means Chief of Mission, which is a fancy guy somewhere that says, yes, we determined that this person did work for the US government, they can apply for SIV. So after the Chief of Mission has sent a letter to the humanitarian parolee's house saying, you've been approved for the process of becoming an SIV, it will give them something called a USCIS receipt number, in which they can watch the process of them becoming an SIV. Now, not everyone is going to get approved by the Chief of Mission for that. And those folks should apply for asylum. And asylum eventually needs to be upgraded to refugee. It's a much longer process. So those are the two different processes. In order to be approved for SIV, they have to go through the Chief of Mission to be granted that. Does that answer your question?
What is so the guys we're working with are currently applying for asylum, I believe.
Okay.
And then did you explain what the next step is after that to get refugee status?
Yeah, I mean, that'll be years down the road for them probably. So they have to apply for asylum, and then they have to go in front of a judge and explain why they're going to die if they go back to Afghanistan, which is not a very fun thing to do, if you can imagine, but all asylum seekers have to do that. The judge determines whether that's accurate or not, and then grants them asylum, which is a fairly long process. And then as soon as they've had asylum granted, that's when they can apply for a status adjustment of becoming a refugee, but not before that. And this is best done. Mary has a better answer than me, maybe.
They have the asylum status for at least a year, and then they can apply for a green card or permanent resident alien status. Same for refugees. So if you get asylum, it's equivalent to being declared that you're basically like a refugee. So I think you're putting in an extra step.
Yeah, sorry.
They go from asylum to permanent resident alien.
Mhm.
And
Great, thank
then
you, Mary.
after permanent resident alien for about 5 years total, then they can apply for a citizenship.
And remind me when they can bring their families?
Oh, never, unfortunately. It was going to be very hard. The US government literally cut that program off because they were overwhelmed by the amount of requests.
Yes, but at the time they go through their court case and granted asylum, it's our understanding that within a certain period of time, they can make application for their families for family reunification. But we're not sure how that works.
They can make that application. We haven't seen any that are successful. Let me see if I can pull up they've just made this new website within the last couple of weeks that explains the reasons why they're not doing that anymore. Basically, it's because their system is overwhelmed. And so let me go ahead and screen share so that you guys can read it for yourselves. It doesn't say it's not possible. It just says it's not likely. Let's see. Information about Afghan nationals. There we go. Okay, so this is the website. And it says parole processing times. We have had so many requests for friends and family to come that instead of the regular 90 days, it's going to take 2 years, is what this says right here. That's a prediction if you do apply for this. You cannot be in Afghanistan to apply for it. That's what this section in the middle right here says. And then if you're outside of Afghanistan, you're more likely to be heard. See. But it's going to take a very long time. So I will send this link because I know that this is a huge question that a lot of Afghan nationals have is how are my families going to get here? And this is sort of answering that, in which it's saying it's going to take a long time. If they're in Afghanistan, there's nothing we can do because we don't have any embassies there. If you're outside of Afghanistan, you have a better shot at it, but it's still going to take a super long time. And also, not just here, but if you go to Uniting for Ukraine, I think that's where this was. No, wait, if you go to I-134, Declaration for Financial Support, we are only accepting online filing for sponsorship for Ukrainians and their immediate families. If you're anyone else, then you can't do it over the internet, which is sort of what USCIS's ways of saying that this is their priority, that they're probably going to be putting Afghanistan applications way lower on the deck than Ukrainian ones. So yeah, I will send you guys these links, but it's not great news for Afghans that are stuck elsewhere.
I'm wondering if it's a different program when we hear the terms family reunification versus humanitarian parole. I wonder if it's two separate phenomenon.
I mean, I can look deeper into it, but I mean, I did a lot of research through the website today because all that recently changed in the last couple of weeks, and it's just not promising. I will send those links to you so that you can look over them yourself or with an immigration lawyer, but it's not promising, unfortunately.
Yep, we'll for sure get in touch with our immigration attorney because what Karen was referring to, we have about 12, 13 people here now, and at least 5, 6, 7 or 8 have families still in Afghanistan. Well, they were in Afghanistan. They've been working, sending money, and have gotten many of their families moved to Iran. But in their minds, they think they're going to come much faster than anything we've ever heard. But we've never heard that anything had been cut off where there wasn't a process for them anymore. And for sure, we don't want to discuss any of that with them. We'll let them deal with the attorney, I think, on what's really happening out there.
Right. So that is my best advice is go talk to an attorney, and I'll send you those links that explain the process. But what I read through basically says that they're overwhelmed by requests for friends and family wanting to come over and that they've stopped processing them. But I hope that's not true. We have lots of churches that are attempting the same thing. None of them have been successful in getting any friends or family over.
Well, we never heard that was a potential that churches could apply for families on behalf of the people who are here. We had understood that the people here, the Afghans, would have to do their own requesting at the appropriate time once they had gone through court, gotten granted, I assume, granted asylum, that then they could apply to get families under what we're hearing is called family reunification. But that's all I know or don't know.
Seems Karen might also be interested about work authorization. We didn't cover that as we were talking about the process of getting to the refugee status. But Karen, so 150 days after the asylum application is lodged, they can apply for work authorization. And that is supposed to take about a month. It has been taking a lot longer, but I think Irene can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that they just put back the rule that USCIS has to process first-time work authorization requests in a month. There is a national delay in processing for renewals. And then it takes another month to process, so typically in past, we've counted that it would take 6 months of being hosted before a person could earn their own income.
So humanitarian parolees that are from Afghanistan or Ukraine are eligible for EAD's work authorization
Instantly?
Yeah, well, I mean, not
Instantly.
instantly, but
Yeah.
I mean, as soon as they apply for it, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the asylum process is horrific. They're lucky if they're working and sustaining their own family within 2 years, if not longer, and still waiting for their court cases.
Right. And then the other piece is that they are granted asylum. So I'm just talking about asylum right now. If they're granted asylum, they're eligible to work from the day they're granted asylum.
So we'll cover asylum more next week.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're gonna have a very long session on asylum next week because it's the most complicated part of the process is getting asylum and sustaining asylum, but probably not for parolees. But you're welcome to come next week. When we cover asylum next week, it's probably going to be more geared towards folks coming from Central America that are coming to a secondary country. That's going to be most of the conversation. But if you have questions about Afghan adjustment, then I'm happy to talk about it in that space as well. But if Afghans apply for asylum, or that they're pretty likely to receive it based on our relationship with Afghanistan and the fact that they were paroled over here. It just takes time and process, and they already have their work authorization from being humanitarian parole. But yeah, I'll send you guys the links about family reunification that's on or about Afghans who were left behind coming over. And you're welcome to talk about it with immigration lawyers. But from our end, we haven't seen any successful applications come through. But hoping that becomes not true someday, because a lot of people were left behind. Okay, the time is now 4 p.m. If you have any further questions, please feel free to send me an email, and I will send all the links in a follow-up. And next week, again, we'll be covering asylum, mostly asylum from folks coming from Central America, but we can also cover adjustment, as I said. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks.